In this video, we're going to take a look at Ein Chorale by Robert Schumann in his collection Album for the Young. We'll take a look at all of the cadences in the second half of the piece, and then we'll take a look at the last two phrases and analyze the chord structures. First, let's go ahead and listen to the piece. Now, when analyzing music, the first thing we need to do is determine the key. And that should be easy enough in this piece. Just look at the key signature, 1 sharp. You know that means the key is either in the key of G major or E minor. And if you look at the first chord and the first melody note, G is the highest and lowest note. And then moving to the very last chord, again, G is the highest and lowest note. So it's pretty clear in this piece it's the key of G major. So let's go ahead and make a chart of all the chords in the key of G major. We do that by writing a G scale, and then for each note of the scale, we'll write a triad. And then finally, we'll label each of those triads. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Notice the 1 chord is major, the 2 chord is minor, the 3 chord is minor, the 4 chord is major, the 5 chord is major, the 6 chord is minor, the 7 chord is diminished. And that will be the list of qualities in any major key. It will always be that particular list of qualities. Also, notice that we use uppercase Roman numerals for the major and lowercase Roman numerals for the minor and also for the diminished. The diminished triad, of course, also has that little circle next to it to indicate that it's diminished. So let's go ahead and look at the last half of the piece, beginning in measure 17, and we can see that moves into a cadence in measure 20. Measure 20, the notes are G, B, and D. That's a 1 chord. And if we look at the beat previously, we see D, that's in the bass and the tenor, F sharp in the alto, and A in the soprano that's been carried over from the third beat. D, F sharp, A, that's the 5 chord. So what we have is 5 going to 1, authentic cadence. Now both the 5 and the 1 chord are in root position. But on the 1 chord, look at the melody. That's not the root in the melody. So therefore, this is not a perfect authentic cadence. Instead, it's an imperfect authentic cadence. Okay, let's look at the next cadence. This is in measure 24. The notes are D, F sharp, A. So this is what we would call a non-final cadence because it is not ending on a 1 chord. The chord previous is G, B, D. That's the 1 chord. So we have a 1 chord moving into the 5 chord. Whenever you move into a 5 chord in a cadence, we call this a half cadence. Okay, next cadence. Measure 28, we actually have 2 chords. This is the G, B, D chord, that's chord number 1, and then the C, E, G chord. So that last chord of the cadence is a 4 chord. Now, so we see here a 1 chord going to a 4 chord. This again is a non-final cadence. You could call this a half cadence, but it's a rather unusual half cadence. Usually half cadences end on a 5 chord. So this is kind of a special half cadence that ends on a 4 chord. And finally, let's move to the very end. This is the very last chord of the piece. We see G, B, and then we see a G in the alto and a G in the soprano. Notice the note D is missing. Sometimes you will see the fifth of chords missing, but we'll assume that's part of the chord anyway. G, B, D, ending on a 1 chord. That's a final cadence. And the chord previous, D, F sharp, A, and an extra note of C. So we have a 5 chord that's actually been built a little bit higher. We'll call that a 5-7 because that additional note is actually the interval of a 7th above the root tone. So 5-7 going to 1, that's an authentic cadence. Both chords are in root position, and the last chord has the root tone in the soprano. Those are all the conditions necessary for us to call this a perfect authentic cadence. Okay, next, let's just take this opportunity to analyze the chords from measure 25 to the end. To do this, we'll put an additional staff below the music, and we'll take the notes that we see and put them on that staff in simplest root position. By placing a chord in simplest root position, it gives us many advantages. We're able to identify the root, the third, and the fifth of the chord, and then we can go back to the music and ask ourselves if that chord is in root position, first inversion, or second inversion. So, measure 25, we see a G, a B, and a D. That, of course, is the 1 chord. G is the root, and we see the root as the lowest pitch in the bass, so we'll just call that a 1 chord. On the second beat, we have the notes C in the soprano and A in the bass. We're going to say that those are really not chord tones. They're just moving through to the next chord. In a later chapter, we'll learn to call those passing tones. So we'll move right to beat 3. And we see a familiar set of chord tones, G, B, and D. So again, the 1 chord. But note the pitch that is in the bass voice, the lowest voice, the B. That's not the root, that's the third of the chord. Therefore, this 1 chord is in first inversion, and we'll write 1-6, which is the figured bass symbol for first inversion. The next chord, this is measure 26, is C, E, G. By putting it in simplest root position, we can see that it is a C major triad, the 4 chord, and we can see that C is the root. Back in the original music, C is the lowest note in the bass, so it's in root position. We will just write 4, roll 4. And the next chord is very familiar. It's just the G, B, D that we've seen many times, so we'll just put the 1 under that again. The next measure, we see C, E, G again. That's the 4 chord that we saw previously. Again, the C is the lowest pitch, so we'll write 4. But look carefully at the next one. We have F sharp, A, we actually have 2 A's, and a C. And if we line that up in simplest root position, F sharp is the lowest pitch, and we find that as the 7 chord in the key of G. So we'll label it as 7. But notice that F sharp is not the lowest pitch in the music, it's A, which as you can see is the third of the chord. So we'll write 7 diminished 6. Now the notes and chords of the cadence we've already looked at, so we'll go a little bit beyond that. This is measure 29. You can see with a quick glance that measure 29 is exactly the same as measure 25, so we'll just apply those same labels. Measure 30, let's take a look at that. That's a little bit complicated. D, F sharp, A, and it's got an extra note C. Now we'll have a whole chapter where we learn these chords that are built up to 4 notes. We call those 7th chords. So this is a 5 chord with an added seventh. We'll call it 5-7. Let's not worry about the actual figured bass symbol here, but let us notice at least that the lowest note is not D, but A, which is the fifth of the chord. And that tells us that it's a second inversion. The next chord is quite familiar. We've seen it many times. G, B, D, that's the one chord. In measure 31, we have A, C, E. We notice that it's the two chord. A is the root, but notice A is not in the bass. C is in the bass. That's the third of the chord. So we will analyze that as 2-6. And then the next two chords we've already done. So that's it. That's Roman numeral analysis for the last two phrases.